Hi everyone, we're going to talk about do loops today. Do loops are an important part of VBA coding. It's one of the key loops that we're going to talk about. It's a little harder than the for loops that we have seen. For loops are pretty straightforward, whereas do loops have several different variations and they can be a little just logically a little tricky. So you want to think through the logic carefully. And try to avoid creating an infinite loop that freezes your computer. You can end a loop prematurely with an exit do statement to avoid an infinite loop, but there are still many different ways to get into an infinite loop situation, especially if you're new to loops. You just have to be sort of ready for freezing out your computer a bunch of times before you get a good handle. So, there's really no magic bullet. You'll have to practice a bunch of times, but I'll go over some strategies and tricks and, sort of tips on how to avoid infinite loops and how to unstuck yourself when you get into that situation. We're going to look at 4 different variations of the do loops. They vary in terms of whether they check the condition at the top versus bottom. So let's take a look. These are the 4 different variations of do loops. You can check the condition. So the condition is a logical condition, a Boolean condition that evaluates the true or false. You can either check the condition at the top or check the condition at the bottom of the loop. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you can see 2 different options. You can have a do until loop or a do while loop. Do until loops will run until the condition is true. So whenever the condition is true, the loop will actually stop. The second one is a do while loop. Do while loop will run as long as the condition is true. So it'll run as long as the condition is true, but whenever the condition becomes false, the loop will stop. You can also check the condition at the bottom. So on the right-hand side, you can see equivalent commands. They're just written a little differently. So you would start with the keyword do, a single keyword, and you can have a bunch of statements inside. And then you will end the loop with loop until, these 2 keywords, and then you check the condition there. So the condition is checked at the bottom of the loop. Same thing with the do while loop. You can start with the single keyword do, and then a bunch of statements, and then you will end with loop while, and you check the condition there. The do while loops will stop when the condition is true. So let's look at these 2 different options of the do while loops. Again, like I said, you can check the condition at the top or check the condition at the bottom. Okay, the 2 ways of writing the loops are almost identical. They're almost 100% equivalent to each other, with one very small but very critical difference, which we'll talk about soon. Okay, but let's just take a look at the structure again. Do until, so the keyword is until here. Well, there are 2 keywords, do and then until. Okay, so, and then it's followed by this Boolean condition statement. So the code inside the loop will run as long as the condition is false. Okay, the loop will stop when the condition is true. On the right-hand side, if you start with the single keyword do, the code will run as long as the condition is false, and the loop will stop when the condition is true. However, the condition is checked at the end, not at the beginning, which leads to the critical difference between the 2. Because on the left-hand side, the condition is checked at the top, the code will not run at all if the initial condition is true. However, because on the right-hand side, the condition is not checked at the bottom, the code will always run at least once, even if the initial condition is true. So let's look at an example. This do while loop example using to check if age is 13 or not. Okay, so we start with these two variables, age equal 10 and is 13 is a Boolean variable, and we set it to be false because age 10 is less than 13. So we have this loop over here on the left-hand side that will run until age hits 13. Okay, so remember this do until loop will run as long as the condition is false. It will stop when the condition is true. So right now, because we're still underage, is 13 is false, this loop will continue to run until is 13 becomes true. Okay, so let's start with the first line of code, do until is 13 right now is false, so we'll proceed to the inside of the loop, right? So we'll look at this if statement, if age less than 13, we'll message box, sorry, you're too young, and then we increment the age by 1. So age equal age plus 1, so now age goes from 10 to 11. Okay, so we don't execute the else statement because age is indeed less than 13. So we'll loop, meaning that you'll go back to the do until statement. So this time is 13 is still false, and then we'll go in and check if age is less than 13. Well, age at this point is 11. It's still less than 13, so we still get the same message, but then we'll increment the age to 12. Okay, so 12, we will loop again, and this time is 13 is still false, so we'll go inside, and 12 is less than 13, so we still get the same message, sorry, you're too young, and then we increment the age by 1, and this time, age is 13. Okay, so we will loop, and the next loop is 13 is still false, actually, because we haven't changed that variable yet. But age is now 13, so within the if statement, the top portion is no longer executed. We have to go to the else clause. So in the else clause, is 13 is flipped from false to true. So now this Boolean variable now has the true value, and we get a message, you're good to go. And then we'll hit loop. Loop will go up to do until. And then this time is 13 is true. And that condition will end this loop. Now, on the right-hand side, you would do the same thing. You start with the do keyword, and we check if age is less than 13. It is. So we get the message, sorry, you're too young, and we increment the age by 1, and then we'll loop. And is 13 is false, so we'll loop and go back to do. And age now 11 is still less than 13. We increment it to 12. And then we loop again. 12 is still less than 13. We still get the same message, sorry, you're too young. And we increment the age to 13. And then we'll go down and loop again. This time, because age is 13, so we no longer execute the first part of the if statement. We instead go into the else clause, and we flip if is 13 from false to true. And we get the message box saying you're good to go. At this point, is 13 is true, and we hit loop until true, which will end the loop. Now let's look at this situation where the initial condition is true. Okay, so we know the loop will stop when condition is true. So if you start with an initial condition that is already true, what's going to happen? Well, on the right-hand side, when we check the condition at the top, do until is 13 is true, and then the loop will end. So right there, the loop ends. None of the stuff that's inside the loop gets executed. However, on the right-hand side, you will get to do at least once because we start with the keyword, the single keyword do. Do does not check any condition, so it'll run the inside of the loop. Well, age is 13, so it's the first part of the if statement does not execute. We go directly into the else clause and we flip is 13 from true to true. So it's still set to true. The message box says you're good to go. And then we hit the loop until true. So at this point, the loop ends. But we already run once of the loop. So just to recap, on the right-hand side, the do until loop will not run at all if the initial condition is true when the condition is checked at the top. However, on the right-hand side, when the condition is checked at the bottom, the loop will always run at least once, even if the initial condition is true. So this portion does not get executed at all on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, I'm sorry. On the right-hand side, you will see that the do loop, the content of the do loop does get executed once. But because age is already 13, the top portion of the if statement does not get executed. However, the second part, the else clause, does get executed. Now let's look at the do while loop. Again, there are two different versions. You can check the condition at the top on the left-hand side, or you can check the condition at the bottom. The do while loop will run as long as the condition is true. The loop will stop when the condition becomes false. When the condition is checked at the top, the loop will not run at all if the initial condition is false. However, when the condition is checked at the bottom, the code will run at least once, even if the initial condition is false. Again, here's an example of do while loop, and we can check the condition at the top or check the condition at the bottom. We start with age as 18 and is 13 variable is set to true. So the loop will run as long as age is 13. Okay, so do while true, and this loop will run because do while runs as long as the condition is true. Okay, so in this case, we'll go inside the loop and we'll see if age is greater than 13, which is true, then we get the message box, you're good to go. And in this particular case, we decrease age by 1. So at this point, age becomes 17. And we skip the else clause. We go to loop. Loop means you go back to the do while statement. At this time, is 13 is still true, so we'll go inside the loop. At this point, age is 17. We check age is still greater than 13, so we still get the same message box, but then we decrease age by 1. So now it's down to 16, and so on and so forth. So you will continue to do this until age becomes 13. Then we will have to execute the else clause and flip is 13 to false, at which point this loop will end. On the right-hand side, it's the same idea, except that we check the condition at the bottom. So what happens when the initial condition is false with a do while loop? Okay, so this is a particular case where age is 12, is 13 is false. Okay, so on the left-hand side, when the condition is checked at the top, do while is 13 equals false, you will end this loop right away. Nothing gets executed. So this code will not run at all because the initial condition is false. On the right-hand side, do, the single keyword, begins this loop, so we don't actually check any condition at the beginning, so we will execute the content of the loop once. Well, age is not greater than 13, so we'll execute the else clause, which flips is 13 to false. Well, it's already false, and now it's false again. And we get the message box, sorry, you're too young, and then we will hit the loop while is 13, which is false, and that false condition ends this while loop. So in this particular case, when the condition is checked at the bottom, the code will run at least once, even if the initial condition is false. So again, on the left-hand side, nothing within the loop gets executed if the initial condition is false. However, the content of the loop does get executed when the initial condition is false. This is because the condition is not checked until the end of the loop. All right, so those are the 4 different versions of the do while loops, 4 different ways to write it. You can write them however you want, whatever that you feel comfortable with. It has to sort of logically make more sense to you, whatever that makes it least likely for you to make a syntactic error. I think you should just go with that version. Okay, so play with the different loops and see which one you're comfortable with. However, no matter which one you get, for somebody who's new to these loops, you are guaranteed to write a couple infinite loops. Okay, it's very easy to write an infinite loop, the loop that goes on forever. You're going to see that a lot. You're going to catch yourself doing that. Basically, you write a do while statement with a condition that's always true. You never have a way to change the condition. So you have to remember to find a way to change the condition within the loop. And the condition has to be able to run, because sometimes it's embedded in the if clause and the condition is never met, right? And do until, it's the same thing. If you have a do until statement with a condition that's always false, then you're going to get an infinite loop. Here's an example. Dim is 13 as Boolean, age is integer, is 13 is true, and then you have a do while loop, is 13, you send this message box, you're good to go, and your loop, you forgot to find a way to change the condition from true to false, so this condition is 13 is always true. And then you just keep looping. You will get an infinite number of this message box. You're good to go. You're good to go. You're good to go. And it just never, the VBA doesn't know when to stop. So your computer will freeze and you will have to find a way to unstuck yourself. Okay, so what do you do if you get an infinite loop? Okay, so an easy way to break out an infinite loop on a Windows machine is to hit Control Break. On the Mac, you will have to push the Escape key. But because everybody's guaranteed to write at least one infinite loop, it's very, very important to save your work frequently to avoid losing your works. As long as you have saved your code, you don't have to worry too much about an infinite loop because you have a way to break out of it. But if you code for hours and then you test your code and it's an infinite loop, you may run the risk of losing all the work you've done for hours. So you should always, always save your work frequently. How to avoid infinite loops? You should test your code very carefully, line by line, especially the loop portion, before you actually run the program, right? So don't hit the green triangle button immediately. You should always test your code thoroughly. So how do you test it? You need to watch the variable value, monitor how it changes. Does it change in a way that's expected? right? Does it increase or decrease over time as expected? And does the loop, are you able to get the loop to end as expected? You should also, when you're running the code for the first time, you should always put a breakpoint inside the loop so that the loop will always stop during the breakpoint, right? And also when it breaks, on the breakpoint, you also always have the option to end the program. So that's a safer way to test run your code before you do the real deal. You should always test the loop several times to see if you can get it to end, right? So you should be able to get it to end consistently, always, right? So every loop, every time, every trial, every sort of time you run the loop, you can always get the loop to come to an end eventually. You need to be able to do this consistently before you officially run the program on your own, right? You can also include an exit statement to break out of the loop. So you can hard code this, right? So with a certain condition, within a certain condition, you can do an XDO or an XSub. So there's no silver bullet, really. The only way to avoid infinite loops is to test, and test, to always test your code, test it thoroughly, step into, look at line by line, right? Hover your mouse over the variable names to see the content variable to make sure that it's incrementing as expected. So what's exit do? Okay, exit do is just a command that you can use to hard code and break out of the loop completely. So here's an example, right? So we may say do while is 13 and you're good to go. What we can do is we can add a counter and see how many times we're doing this, right? So if you've been running this over and over again, and the counter is getting to 10, so they're like you're really only expecting to run the loop a few times. So if maybe you only expect this loop to run, 3 times, but the counter is up to 10. So when it's getting to a really, really large number that you did not expect, then you can just do an exit do. Okay, so you can sort of build that into your code as a safety net or safety precaution. That is all we have for the do loop lecture. If you have any questions about the loop, please let me know. I'm happy to answer questions during our office hours.